Okay, so hi everyone. My name is Dmitry Zhikharevich. I'm a researcher at the STS Center, European University in St. Petersburg. And we're continuing our series on the social studies of climate change, a series of seminars. And today we're very happy to have Rebekka Elliottt with us, who will talk about loss and the social life of climate change, about her work on the concept of loss in its relation to the sociology or social life of climate change. Rebekka is assistant professor in the Department of Sociology at London School of Economics. She is a sociologist. She did a PhD in sociology at Berkeley, and she works at the intersection of economic sociology, political and environmental sociology, as well as science studies, working particularly on the intersections of economic and environmental problems. And this year, Rebekka published a book, Underwater, Loss, Flood Insurance, and the Moral Economy of Climate Change in the United States, 2021, Columbia University Press. So today, Rebekka will talk about, as I said, about loss, about her previous work on loss, and the ways in which climate change as a problem can contribute to social theorizing. So without further ado, Rebekka, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Great. Good afternoon. Thank you, Dmitry, for the kind invitation to join you here today. And thank you to all of those of you who are here in attendance. And thank you to those of you who will watch this later. As Dmitry mentioned, I will be talking about some previous work that I've done on loss, and I'll kind of set the stage with that, and then use the thematic of loss to share a little bit more from my recent book, which Dmitry just mentioned. So I'd like to start with a quotation from the late British sociologist John Urry. "Now we are in a new epoch, in the new century. The world looks different, and issues of resource depletion, contestation, and collapse will haunt it, and more parochially, sociology, in some potentially catastrophic decades to come." So for me, this was one of those quotations that you read and it stops you in your tracks. And if you read it quickly, it perhaps doesn't sound that revelatory. This observation may seem pretty obvious, especially in 2021, with the kind of recent California wildfire seasons, which are pictured here, and other disasters all over the world, and rising seas kind of slowly swallowing Pacific islands, already observed
Rebekka,
sea level.
Sorry to interrupt. I think we don't see the changes on the screen. Can you?
Oh.
So should fix that first.
Yeah, sorry. So what are you seeing now?
I think we're just seeing the title slide.
Oh, that's so weird.
So
let me, oh, okay, sorry. How's that?
Yeah, thanks. It works.
Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so this image shows is an image from one of the recent California wildfire seasons. And other kinds of changes to the world around us. So already observed sea level rise increases, making storm surges higher, farmers in places as different as California and sub-Saharan Africa afflicted by longer and deeper droughts, diminished groundwater supply and soil degradation, and people, disproportionately poor and marginalized people, dying in floods, storms, and heat waves. But the particular syntax of this quotation, that this depletion, this contestation, this collapse would haunt sociology, that's really what gave me pause and led me to a particular problematic. And that problematic was, well, how does it haunt sociology? What does climate change contribute to sociology in a kind of odd sense? And that's actually a very different question from the one that is perhaps more commonly asked in talks like this one, which is the inverse, right? What can sociology, or what can history, or what can the social sciences more generally contribute to our understanding of climate change or action on climate change? In some way, that's the brief of this seminar series. What can social science or the social studies of climate change contribute? So the project, when the question is posed that more conventional way, is one of bringing our tools, some of which may have been developed without climate change in the analytical frame, to bear on this crisis. So to turn the question around, to ask, what does climate change contribute to sociology, is to ask instead, which of sociology's core concerns have to change? How is climate change poised to destabilize conventional understandings, concepts, subfields, and so forth? And I think a second part of that is, what new projects does climate change generate for sociology and other disciplines? If we start from the observation that the climate changes and changes other things, and in specifically destructive ways, then what can and should sociology endeavor to know about this particular form of social change? So my broad objective today is to offer some reflection on that problematic. And I'll do that first by outlining what I've called the sociology of loss as a project, a new project that crosses and links some of sociology's otherwise kind of balkanized subfields. And this sociology of loss, I think, is one way to build a sociology of climate change. And so I'll start by doing that in very general terms. And in the second part of the talk, I'll try to illustrate this more precisely with reference to research that I've done on flood insurance and climate change. And I'll share some of the data and analysis from my recent book. And finally, I'll contextualize the whole approach in broader, kind of semi-coordinated, interdisciplinary moves towards what we might call the social life of climate change. Okay, so this part of the talk is really kind of presenting a paper that I published in the European Journal of Sociology in December 2018. So if you're interested in reading more about this, it is out there, it's published. So let me, first give you a sense of where this all comes from in the kind of biographical or experiential sense, because all of our work is socially situated and our biographies and our experiences shape the provocations that we arrive at and the ones we choose to pursue. And I think this is an important thing to do at the outset too, because, a lot of what I'm reacting to is a particular experience of disciplinary life, and more specifically even Anglo-American sociology. And so some of the kinds of characterizations are coming from that, relatively kind of provincial standpoint. And in the Q&A, I'd be really curious to kind of hear more about the sort of disciplinary and interdisciplinary engagements with climate change in Russia and elsewhere. But for me, in graduate school, one of the things I was continually somewhat bemused by, I suppose, was because I did research on climate change, because that was kind of my topic, I was always pegged as a so-called environmental sociologist. And that's because in Anglo-American sociology, research on climate change has largely taken place within that silo. So you don't actually see a lot of articles on climate change published in, so-called mainstream or general interest journals. So you have a lot of environmental sociologists talking to each other about climate change, which has been very productive and inspiring for me. But you don't see as much engagement beyond that as we might like, especially because we know, of course, and environmental sociologists have shown that climate change is not and cannot be understood as a kind of narrowly environmental problem. So the other thing for me personally was that the theoretical tools that I was using for my own research on climate change weren't principally coming from environmental sociology. They were coming from economic sociology, from political sociology, and from the sociology of knowledge and science and technology studies. So the question coming out of this personal experience of Anglo-American sociology was, well, how do we put climate change on the agenda for a wider swath of the discipline? How do we get the discipline to engage more frontally and forcefully with what is a planetary and civilizational set of challenges? How do we convince more sociologists that climate change is actually relevant to their intellectual concerns and projects? Okay, so that's kind of the biographical origin story of the sociology of loss. But more substantively, even if those disciplinary concerns did not exist, I became convinced that the sociology of loss constituted one of these important new projects for engaging with, in particular, what the climate crisis is already doing to places, people, and social practices. So, here, what I'm suggesting is the sociology of loss is one new project of potentially many. I think climate change can and should provoke many and varied kinds of theorizations and re-theorizations for sociologists, for social scientists, for scholars in the humanities, all of which can turn into work to kind of clarify the stakes, the consequences of the threats that societies and individuals face. So in the paper, I articulate climate change to research concerns and conclusions from a number of sociological subfields through this thematic of loss to kind of show how, conventional ways of approaching popular topics in these other subfields, are useful for thinking in more direct terms about climate change. And I also tried to kind of thematize loss as it appears in some of the sociological research on climate change. So there are kind of 4 dimensions of loss that I look at in this paper. Each dimension is anchored in a different tradition of sociological research. So the first is to think about the materiality of loss, which I relate to ongoing concerns in urban and rural sociology. And what I mean by this is, what climate change confronts sociology with is the possibility of the land literally disappearing beneath our feet. The material, physical loss of a place. And this brings kind of new valence to ideas about the loss of place that have been developed in urban and rural sociology, which when loss of place is invoked in that discipline, it's more typically about a social group being kind of untethered from a community that they have historical attachments to through processes like gentrification, for instance. But it's a little bit different to say that the place itself might no longer exist because of sea level rise, or because it burns to the ground, or because it's blown over in a hurricane. And when we think about the material loss of place, then that loss becomes much more ambivalent. When in the kind of conventional thinking about loss of place as sort of loss of community, loss of attachment, That's regarded as traumatic, as a source of grief. When you're threatened with the loss of a place because of its kind of ecological, biophysical, geographical precarity, you might want to let go of a place. You might want to leave it. That will be difficult, of course, because all change is difficult, but it might not be detrimental to one's well-being, to a community's kind of collective chances, as we might otherwise be thinking. The second dimension is the politics of loss. So thinking about the ways that constituencies and coalitions might develop around some of the losses that get associated with climate change. And I'll talk more about this in the context of my own research in a little bit. But also thinking about the ways that climate change intersects with a broader suite of policies that affect the way that people live their lives, that affect, how people are housed, how people are employed. All of these policies we can think about the ways that they might be strained by some of the extant and future effects of climate change. The third dimension is knowledge of loss. And here, situating these concerns in economic sociology and the sociology of knowledge, which are really questions about, how do we know loss when we see it? How do we attribute it to climate change as opposed to other things, or in addition to other things? What are the kinds of knowledge practices that people, experts, kind of epistemic communities have created in order to understand loss as a thing in the world? And again, this is also relevant to my own project, and I'll talk more about it in detail in a bit. And then the fourth dimension is practices of loss. And here, situating these concerns in the sociology of consumption, to think about the consumption, in particular, the consumption practices that have to change individually and collectively in order to make meaningful progress on mitigating the worst impacts of climate change. So thinking about what sociologists might have to say about kind of dehabituating from commuting by car in favor of commuting by bicycle. And here kind of drawing on really interesting and productive work by folks like Elizabeth Shove and Alan Ward, who've talked about the ways that kind of energy use and resource consumption are kind of built into not just culture, but also physical infrastructures in ways that we might think more critically about. So this is not exhaustive, of course. The idea here was to kind of set out a menu of possibilities to identify new touch points between the field and climate change, as well as to kind of reread ongoing conversations about some of these subfield concerns through this lens of loss. But let's kind of back up for a moment, because the first question ought to be why loss specifically? And I have a few reasons here. The first is that loss is, I think, what we're contending with here. Potentially societally destabilizing losses. Loss, I think, captures succinctly all of that depletion, that destruction, that disappearance that the John Ury quote references, the quote that I began with. Second, the climate crisis is here. So throughout the paper, I bias my choice of empirical cases and examples toward those that are available to us in the present moment. So, of course, we've always lived in and with a changing climate, but now we're experiencing and observing losses from the destabilizing boost given to climatic conditions by human activities. So the problems of loss that we ought to be interested in cannot be analytically or ethically consigned to the future. This isn't arguing about the discount rate anymore. And while sociology and the social sciences ought to kind of contemplate the future of societies vis-a-vis climate change, I think the thematic of loss brings us back to the present. It highlights the fact that climate change already offers conditions that are ripe for methodological and analytical study. And climate change is the present for sociology and the social sciences. To ignore it is to ignore the world we currently inhabit. And third, loss is perhaps a provocative riposte to the much more common thematic in the social sciences of climate change, which is sustainability. So, if you're someone who's kind of been engaging in the social studies of climate change, you've undoubtedly encountered sustainability. It frames research grants, it frames journals, it frames special issues, right? It's kind of, a major buzzword in this space, a paradigm even. Loss, I think, adjusts the analytical focus. It asks about what does or will or must disappear rather than about what can or should be sustained. So loss, of course, is a more ambivalent outcome, though it doesn't necessarily imply pessimism or catastrophism. But where sustainability is often mobilized as a kind of overtly normative project of harmony and holism, the identification of win-wins for the planet and for people, and sometimes for profit, the reproduction of a certain kind of status quo, and the voluntarism of enlightened actors, right? So these are framings with different moods, where sustainability is perhaps, very sunny, loss is melancholy. And though social scientific critiques of sustainability abound, I think deploying sociology and social science more generally on this terrain or in those terms occludes certain things from view. So by drawing attention to loss, I think sociology can actually leverage or even celebrate its critical distance from climate change research and from the policymaking world that it informs. It can highlight contradiction. So what is lost so that other things can be sustained? And it can imagine more deeply transformative visions, what might take the place of what is lost. Okay, so let me now say a bit about how I'm operationalizing loss here. So first, loss is both an object and a process. There are losses of property, of life, of livelihood, and there is the losing, which might happen in the span of hours when a hurricane pummels a city, or over years, as when rising seas generate everyday tidal flooding that makes normal routines impossible. Loss, of course, more broadly beyond climate change, is also a universal and unavoidable human experience, right? We all know what it is to lose. We will all deal with loss at some point in our lives. The loss of a job, the loss of a home, the loss of a loved one. And indeed, if you were to Google the sociology of loss, what you would find is a lot of research that focuses on that kind of interior, individual, traumatic experience of loss. So, research on job loss, on divorce, on bereavement, and so forth. But when we think about climate change and loss, we're interested too in how particular kinds of losses might be socially organized and patterned. So as we all presumably know, climate change is a global problem, but it enters a socially stratified world in which the already marginalized stand to lose a great deal more, and in which some people and industries might even stand to win. And finally, loss has both a quantitative and qualitative character. And this ended up being really important for my research, because when you lose, you might have less of something, less money, less biodiversity, for example. So it's those quantitative losses that tend to preoccupy experts' attempts to measure and model as a way of grasping what is or will be quantitatively different in a climate changed world. how many fewer species will we have, or how will kind of GDP decline or grow more slowly, or what have you. And I'll say more about this actually in a moment. But you can also lose things that are qualitatively distinct. The disappearance of ways of life, of landscapes, of places, of cultures, things that can be memorialized, but not recovered or recouped or compensated. Now, I'm obviously not the only person thinking about loss and climate change. Loss has also in recent years become a policy object of concern. So the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, enacted the Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage associated with climate change impacts at the 19th COP in 2013. So this kind of L&D mechanism, loss and damage mechanism, is a new policy paradigm that's meant to encompass both extreme and slow onset events with a focus on developing countries that are particularly vulnerable to the adverse effects of climate change. So the L&D mechanism kind of concedes that there are certain limits to adaptation, which are defined by the intersection of climate change and the biophysical and socioeconomic constraints of particular places. You know, countries that played the smallest role in causing climate change stand to be among the biggest losers here. So the mechanism provides a venue for policymakers and publics to negotiate what actions must take place within the kind of residual policy gap between climate change adaptation, disaster risk reduction, and available risk transfer tools. You know, how should the rich world mobilize resources to address permanent losses of livelihoods and landscapes in poorer countries? And what this has launched is a kind of new research program into solving conceptual and operational problems in defining and attributing loss, a kind of, quote, science of loss, which has been focused in particular on how to account for some of these non-economic losses that are listed at the bottom of this graphic here, or not listed, but kind of visually represented. So the sociology of loss that I've put out here, it takes a kind of broader view than this. It actually, I think, identifies this very work of trying to account for non-economic loss as something that sociologists ought to be interested in kind of critically understanding. So it's untethered from this particular project and these kinds of specific objectives of international climate policy, but it could inform them nevertheless. Okay, so that may all still sound quite vague. So I'm going to try to get more specific with reference to my own research and try to show how a sociology of loss and some of the concerns that I've just outlined helps us to analyze some of the effects of climate change on individuals, communities, places, and so forth. And I'll do that by sharing with you some of the material from my recently published book, Underwater. And I'll focus in particular on a story that I tell in chapter 3 of the book called Visions of Loss. So the book is about flood insurance in the US. So, you know, why is insurance instructive here? You may be thinking, well, of course, insurance is about loss. Insurance is the institution that societies use to manage loss. Insurance economically values it. It sets expectations about future losses. It puts in place arrangements to compensate loss. People purchase insurance because they want security in the event that they suffer a financial loss. But in the book, I examine and I think about loss in a more capacious sense than the one that is endemic to insurance. Indeed, in the broader sense of loss that I've just outlined. because there are losses at stake here that are not only financial, but are also social and emotional, losses that can't be compensated, and so instead are resisted or mourned. And what's relevant to people as they confront loss in this fuller sense are questions about what is fair and valuable, what needs protecting and what should be let go, who deserves assistance and on what terms, and whose vision of the future should be used to govern the present. And all of these questions kind of crop up in the contestation around flood insurance arrangements in the US. And there are no answers to those questions, of course, but there are settlements, and those settlements have huge social and material implications, because reforming the terms of an institution like flood insurance involves a negotiation about who can live where, at what cost, for how long, on what terms, and who has to potentially lose or let go. So when climate change is kind of channeled through insurance, and I'll talk more specifically about how that happens in this case, its precise effects on lives and landscapes depend on how insurance gets harnessed to and how it potentially reconfigures various interventions that target individual and collective security as the climate continues to change. So the chapter I'll be talking more about in a few moments examines a recent effort to make flood insurance formally account for climate change. And what I'll try to show in this context is that efforts to assess risk, to price it, to come up with a vision of loss, efforts to come up with a kind of technically adequate understanding of loss for governing the present, those efforts can never actually be purified of the kinds of dilemmas that I've mentioned. In fact, those dilemmas are kind of at the core of some of those efforts. So in terms of kind of where the chapter is situated in the broader project of the sociology of loss that I've outlined, this kind of central concerns that end up being relevant here in this particular chapter, at least, are about the politics of loss and knowledge of loss. And I'll kind of return to that towards the end. Okay, so let me now give you a bit more context about the particular flood insurance arrangements that I explore in the book. The book examines the past, present, and future of the US National Flood Insurance Program, or the NFIP. Now, the NFIP is actually a very old program. It was established by the US Congress in 1968, so long before climate change was kind of on anyone's radar. And it was established by Congress because private insurers could not be convinced to sell flood insurance on their own. It was too risky a peril. You know, the risks were too tightly correlated. It would be too expensive. No one would buy it. So importantly, this means that this program, the NFIP, is a public one. It's run by the federal government, so it's not a private company. It provides about $1.3 trillion in insurance coverage in over 22,000 communities around the United States. And it's run by this federal agency, FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, which is responsible for mapping the nation's flood zones. So coming up with a kind of visualization of flood risk, which we'll talk more about at length. And second, for setting the price paid for a federal flood insurance policy. Now it tries to do this actuarially in the ways that private insurers do, but again, it is not a private program. This isn't a private market. The other thing that makes it interesting is that it's a hugely beleaguered and controversial program. So it's been billions of dollars in debt to the US Treasury since Hurricane Katrina in 2005. It's also largely failed to prevent continued building and rebuilding in harm's way, which was a big part of the reason for starting the program, the thinking being that assessing risk, pricing risk would send a signal about the places that perhaps should not be inhabited or not be developed, and that largely has not worked. So today people point to this program's shortcomings as evidence that it's not equipped to manage the immense losses we are already experiencing and expect to see more of as the climate crisis intensifies. You know, if it's already billions and billions of dollars in debt, then it's not breaking even. It hasn't created a financial arrangement to absorb and compensate loss. It's also forged unexpected alliances. If you know anything about American politics, you know it's highly polarized, but Democrats and Republicans have managed to find common cause around flood insurance throughout its history. Conservatives have formed coalitions with environmentalists who, you know, they're typically on opposite sides of issues. Homeowners at risk, homeowners in some of the worst flood zones in the country have allied with the very building and real estate interests who some might blame for putting them in the flood zones to begin with. So as I studied some of the kind of historical and contemporary conflicts around this program, the various actors that I encountered in this story, homeowners, government officials, scientists, engineers, insurance professionals, lawyers, housing advocates, and others, they couldn't talk about what is wrong with the NFIP or what needed to be made right without talking about what is fair, prudent, just, deserved, or equitable. So claims about flood maps, about risk classifications and the price of premiums, even when they're couched in a language of scientific accuracy, as they typically are, also always draw upon a backdrop of normative commitments about what states and markets and individuals can or ought to do. So ultimately, I came to see the NFIP, to see flood insurance as an opportunity to think through the moral economy of climate change in the US. So by this, I mean, it's of course a site for witnessing the entanglements of moral ideas and claims, for instance, about a fair price or fair responsibilities, to see those entanglements with economic arrangements. But in a broader sense, I think the NFIP participates in shaping the kind of problem that climate change is considered to be in the US, as well as who is responsible for addressing it and how. So I argue in the book that from the NFIP, we can appreciate that the thorniest challenges when it comes to the problem of loss are unsettled and unsettling questions of responsibility for loss, justification of loss, and compensation for loss. Okay, so with all of that kind of prefacing done, let me tell you now a story from the book about contested visions of loss. And that story has to do in particular with the way that FEMA, which again is this government agency that runs the flood insurance program, the way that it maps flood zones for the purposes of insurance rating in the NFIP. So up here on the left, we have what New York City's flood insurance rate map looked like when Hurricane Sandy hit the city in 2012. And this map was based largely on data from 1983. Floodplains all over the US have their own versions of these flood insurance rate maps if they participate in the program. And the maps are what make it possible to rate insurance on the basis of risk. So the way it works, briefly, is that your house is located on one of these maps, and the flood zone that you're in, and the height of your property relative to the height of the expected floodwaters, that's all entered into an insurance rating formula to arrive at a price for your annual insurance premium. So on the right, you can see what these instruments actually look like when they're put to use. And the general idea is that if the map shows that you are at high risk, your insurance premium should be correspondingly higher than what it would be if you were in a lower risk zone, or if your house was built at a higher elevation. And if you live inside one of these high risk zones and you have a federally backed mortgage, you're legally required to carry and pay for flood insurance. So it's technically not a cost you can just decide not to bear. If you require a loan to maintain a property, then you have to carry flood insurance if you're in a flood zone. The maps also have what are called kind of off-label uses. So they're used to establish building codes, they're used for planning decisions. So of course, it's helpful to know where the boundaries of the flood zones are, the areas that are more or less likely to experience flood loss, if you're trying to figure out where to build or redevelop or potentially abandon. So when Hurricane Sandy hit New York City in 2012, the map on the books, that map based on 1983 data, predicted only 54% of the area in the borough of Queens that flooded, and only 67% of the areas that flooded on Staten Island, which is down here. So in other words, a lot of areas that were kind of not supposed to flood, at least in the projections of official imaginaries, did indeed flood. So from this episode, it looks to many observers like the maps are very outdated. They're very bad. They're not good maps. They're not helping us, make decisions. Now, years before Sandy, actually, in 2007, then Mayor Michael Bloomberg launched this kind of Plan YC effort that was going to make New York City greener and greater. And this effort included a formal request that FEMA update the city's long outdated maps to account for sea level rise. By 2012, sea level at the Battery in New York City had observably increased, and these kinds of changes the city wanted reflected. So the city had been requesting new maps for a long time, even before Sandy revealed those maps' shortcomings. And the city wanted updated maps because of their use in planning and building code regulation, with an eye towards making decisions about real estate development and housing with an eye toward adapting to climate change, making those decisions in a kind of savvy and informed way. So then New York City gets its wish after Sandy. It gets new maps from FEMA. So the old map is on the left, the new map is on the right. And what you can tell just kind of at a glance is that those official flood zones, those places where people have to purchase flood insurance, they've grown. What's also happened is that what's called the base flood elevation was going higher in a lot of places, which means that people were now, who previously thought that they'd been built to a code where they were above the height of expected floodwaters, were now finding out they were indeed below. Now, these new maps did not account for climate change in any formal way, and they didn't even actually account for the flooding from Sandy. But even still, ultimately, the new maps put almost 400,000 New Yorkers in the city's high-risk flood zones, which made it the nation's largest floodplain by population. And it more than doubled the number of structures inside the zones from around 35,000 to over 71,000. So that new map on the right, actually the boundaries of the new flood zones really closely track the inundation line from Sandy. So if Sandy flooded, it's in the flood zone, more or less. Now, the areas hardest hit by Sandy and also most affected by these new maps are perhaps not what you have in mind when you think of New York City. These are the kind of outer borough areas, particularly on Staten Island and in Queens and Brooklyn, where you'll find kind of working lower to middle income residents, cops, firefighters, nurses, teachers, sanitation workers. These are parts of the city where it's been possible for lower income, middle class people to buy homes. Some of these areas look actually quite suburban, kind of freestanding single family homes, not kind of dense high-rise apartments that you might associate with Manhattan. many of these neighborhoods are majority white in what is otherwise a minority white city. The racial homeownership gap in New York City is significant, as it is nationwide in the US. Though Canarsie was particularly affected, and Canarsie has been a kind of historical bastion of Black property ownership in New York City. So though New York City had been requesting this flood risk and map update even before Sandy, and though city authorities framed that update as part of its climate change governance, and though FEMA's new maps closely matched the inundation line from the storm that had just taken place, New York City's Office of the Mayor ultimately filed a formal appeal of these new maps. So this appeals process is available to NFIP communities who believe that they can show, on the basis of their own risk assessment, that FEMA got it wrong. The boundaries of the zones are in the wrong places, the flood elevations are too high or too low. So New York City claimed that FEMA had overestimated the expected flood elevations by over 2 feet and had unnecessarily mapped 26,000 buildings and 170,000 residents into high-risk flood zones. So the city's appeal argued that FEMA's models were wrong. The city's consultants created new models. They produced their own maps. And in the city's version of the maps, the flood zones shrank. They're much smaller. Now, normally, these kinds of map appeals produce one revised map. FEMA can decide to kind of take on board the rival risk assessment or not, or they can incorporate some elements of it and not others. And in practice, map appeals are almost always successful. If you go to the trouble of spending the resources to appeal, you're almost always going to be rewarded with a new revised map. But this time, and for the first time, the outcome was different. So the compromise ultimately reached between the city and FEMA was not one map, but 2 maps. First, a flood insurance rate map of current flood risk that would incorporate some of the city's revisions, and a, quote, non-regulatory map of future flood conditions that would visualize multiple projections of sea level rise with varying degrees of uncertainty. And this outcome is peculiar in the sense that it effectively tries to stabilize the climate changed present, in which sea levels around New York City have observably risen, and parse it from the climate change future. But of course, any estimate of risk, even quote unquote current risk, implies an orientation to the future. Risk information is meant to bring the future into the domain of action in the present. So it requires a certain amount of kind of mental gymnastics to understand flood risk and hazards as represented by both of these maps together. So just to kind of stress here that this map of current risk is going to be used to rate flood insurance. It's going to be the map that affects what people pay for the way that flood risk has changed in the city. The other map of future conditions will be used to inform planning and land use decisions. So this is a quote from Dan Zerilli, New York City Director of the Office of Recovery and Resiliency. FEMA's decision to redraw New York City's flood maps and to work with us to produce innovative, climate-smart flood maps allows us to begin separating the calculation of annual insurance premiums against current risk from the necessary long-term planning and building we need to do as a city to adapt to rising seas and climate change. So these are viewed as doing kind of different kinds of work. So what's going on here? What made these maps so troublesome that they had to be multiplied in order to do these different kinds of work? And that's where we start to see this fuller sense of the losses at stake when it comes to which vision for New York City is going to be authoritative, which vision is going to be allowed to do what. So across a few chapters of the book, I trace what happened as these new maps rolled out in New York City and what made them so problematic that they were appealed, even though they largely corresponded to what had just happened in Sandy, and even though they met demands that the city had previously issued itself. So I do that tracing ethnographically and through interviews as I follow the flood insurance rate map onto the streets and into the homes of the people who would be affected by it. So to give you a sense of what I found, I'll tell you the story of Palmer Doyle, whose story actually begins the entire book. So Palmer is a retired firefighter who lives in a modest home in Rockaway, Queens, in one of these high-risk flood zones. And in early 2013, he received a letter and then collected a lot of other documentation, which he's pictured showing me here, explaining that his flood insurance premiums would be changing because the city had received those new maps, which showed that his home faced worse flood risk. Congress had also passed new flood insurance rating rules the previous summer. So the result of all of these changes was that his and his neighbors' insurance premiums were set to increase from hundreds to thousands of dollars per year. And when he received this news, Palmer was finishing repairs on his home, which had taken on 8.5 feet of water during Hurricane Sandy just a few months before. And because he lives in an official high-risk flood zone, according to these maps, and because he has a mortgage, he's one of those people who is required by law to have a flood insurance policy in place, as are most of his neighbors. So he's worried about a wave of foreclosures if he and his neighbors can't afford to pay the new rates. And perhaps even more troublesome, who would buy their risky homes with these new huge flood insurance premiums attached to them? His property value would take a massive hit. And this is really important in a context like the United States, where people rely on the kind of continued growth of property values as a strategy for saving for retirement, for putting kids through school, for all kinds of strategies to kind of produce individual and collective economic security. So Palmer has to contemplate a bewildering set of options, which are available to him according to the terms of his insurance policy. He can elevate his home if he wants to try to get it back above the base flood elevation, which would turn his home back into a construction site. That would mitigate his risk, it would lower his premiums, but it costs about $100,000 to do. That's money he doesn't have at the ready. Or, of course, he could get his family out of harm's way and off the hook for flood insurance by leaving his neighborhood altogether, right? He can just get out of the flood zone. But this would mean leaving behind family, friends, and a lifetime of memories. Now, in the meantime, Palmer had already used the claims money that he got from his existing flood policy, as well as his own savings, to repair his house back to a livable condition, which left him vulnerable to the next catastrophic flood, which government officials, scientists, journalists kept telling him is coming. So it seemed to Palmer that there were no good options here, even though, of course, he wanted to protect his house and his family. They were facing the prospect of losing too much, and what was happening to them, he said, just wasn't fair. He had barely survived the flood, only to worry that maybe he wouldn't survive the increase in flood insurance rates. So the dilemmas facing Palmer are in some ways emblematic of things that were happening to lots of New Yorkers like him. And it soon became clear to homeowners around the country as FEMA went about updating maps in other inhabited floodplains. So some families had to confront the possibility of being priced out of their homes and neighborhoods and losing tremendous value on their most important asset in the process, their house. At the same time, the losses they were facing were not only things that could be calculated in dollars and cents. They were the loss of a sense of security, a rhythm of life, connections to a community or history, and the stable meanings that root a sense of identity and belonging. So very briefly, what happens on the ground is that homeowners in New York City and other Sandy-affected areas that got their new maps first basically go into open revolt. Homeowners are losing value on their property. Some are being priced out. They're being financially squeezed at precisely the same time that they're recovering from Sandy. and all to pay for flood risk and loss that they do not believe they materially caused. So people are basically saying to their city councilmen, to their representatives in Congress, you're telling me we've got to prepare for climate change, and climate change is creating worse floods, and I'm the one who has to pay for it? And here I think is where we get some leverage on understanding the politics of loss, because one of the things I want to note here is that when these residents organize around all that they stand to lose, they organize as flood zone homeowners. So the lines drawn around the flood zones on the map itself help to forge this shared category that individuals can identify with. It's how they know that they have that loss in common. So what happens is actually that this organizing in the flood zones affected by Sandy and affected by this kind of first round of map updates in New York and New Jersey, that organizing ends up going national. It turns into a kind of grassroots network called Stop FEMA Now, of flood zone homeowners who want some reprieve from the increases in flood insurance rates. So when the New York City Office of the Mayor launches its appeal to tell FEMA, hey, you're getting it wrong, this allows them to be on the side of these homeowners and constituents who are facing these very scary losses. But of course, it's a tough needle to thread, right? So Dan Zerilli, again, who's the head of the New York City Office of Recovery and Resilience, in the appeal documentation, in the kind of letter to FEMA, he says, the city takes flood risk very seriously. The city is not trying to kind of put its head in the sand and deny that flood risk is perhaps the most significant hazard facing the city. But to the press, he also notes, being included in a flood zone can have a devastating impact on neighborhoods. A Queens City councilman named Donovan Richards, he says, it was necessary for the city to do it, to try to keep that affordability for homeowners. But we also have to be cautious and not shrink the map to the extent that if another storm comes, these homeowners would not have been in the flood zone. So here's where the story gets even a little more complicated. At the same time that these new rate maps are becoming locally controversial in New York City, there's something going on at the national level, which is that a group of experts called the Technical Mapping Advisory Council, or the TMAC, are meeting by order of Congress in order to develop recommendations for how FEMA could incorporate climate science into its assessments and maps of flood risk, which is part of a larger project of making flood insurance formally account for climate change. So that group of experts, the TMAC, they were very clear on the technical strategy. If the task is to account for climate change in the methods that we use to assess flood risk and to map it, in their view, pretty straightforward. There are ways that we rely on in other contexts to incorporate projections of future conditions into flood maps, and they outline these technical strategies in their report. But the question was, would these maps of future flood conditions be regulatory? In other words, would they be used somehow to rate flood insurance now? The outrage that had taken place in New York City was laying plain the difficulties that might cause. Because if those climate inclusive maps were indeed used to rate flood insurance, the TMAC noted, the potential for additional appeals should be considered. So FEMA might succeed in transforming its mapping to account for climate change, but if communities appealed every time a map was updated to show that the risk was a lot worse, they might be dead letters, basically. Furthermore, if future conditions become linked to mandatory insurance requirements, an analysis of the impact to property owners may need to be conducted. Issues of equity and affordability associated with insurance premiums need to be considered. And this is in large part what homeowners were protesting about. So the TMAC kind of demurs. It leaves these questions to be worked out by FEMA in its interactions with the communities that it's reassessing and remapping, which is really what allows for that two-map outcome in New York City. Because FEMA decided that all future conditions flood risk products would be for advisory purposes only. Local communities get the information, they can decide how to use it. But their residents won't be compelled to pay a risk-based insurance premium on that basis. So this outcome in New York City would be a kind of demonstration project for how this could proceed around the country as maps were redrawn, now with a view towards climate change. So what's interesting here to me is that the problem in New York City is not climate denialism, nor is it a lack of technical procedures for figuring out how to make flood maps incorporate sea level rise or climate science. FEMA's experts believe they have a credible and feasible way to do that. This rather peculiar two-map solution, which is the outcome of a technical debate between modelers about the right way to estimate risk, reflects the efforts of a variety of social actors to sort out these very complicated questions of which vision of loss, based on which assemblage of credible scientific information, can be used to govern the present. What kinds of adaptations are justifiable in the present to prepare for a climate change future, and for whom? And who can be made financially responsible for climate change's effects and when? So to put that a little bit more plainly, flood insurance, at least as it's designed, is meant to make actuarial rating at the individual property level possible. So if your home is at higher risk than your neighbors, you pay a higher insurance premium. The risk and the premium track together. Now, if that risk goes up on a new set of maps, and if that risk is expected to get even worse with climate change, what kind of responsibility ought the homeowner who bought her house 10 years ago or 20 years ago bear? And how do those responsibilities relate to those of other actors like government or private industry? So insurance always enacts contestable designations of who is obligated and who is empowered to act, how and when, to manage risk and to compensate loss. But when climate change enters the political and calculative frame, it unsettles some of those designations. So the two maps separate strategies of technical assessment in ways that align with kind of distinct temporalities of responsibility. Contestation over how to define risk produces an understanding of these maps and the models that underpin them as essentially different, as useful for doing different kinds of work. So the regulatory map of current risk used to rate insurance does not make climate change's effects per se the responsibility of individual insured homeowners, though of course this mobilizes an implicit understanding that climate change is still a problem of the future, not the present. So it provides a kind of reference frame for a political morality of risk in which residents are not made financially responsible for climate risks in any explicit way. Whereas the non-regulatory maps of future conditions provide a reference frame for a political morality of risk in which communities, and here really governance authorities, have an imperative to, in a sense, embrace their future risk, to give at least the appearance of control through evidence gathering, representation, and planning. So the second set of maps perform a vulnerability to climate change under multiple scenarios that is economically viable in the face of hazards so long as you can plan for it. So on its face, the New York City appeal can be read as this kind of familiar story about, self-interested homeowners, reckless and greedy developers, venal city politicians interfering with science. But upon closer examination, the fight over the science of flood risk, in a context where there's considerable political will to address climate change impacts and to avoid losses, does not lead to ignoring science, but rather, in a sense, to its proliferation, to the crafting of instruments that manage the political and moral problems that arise from science-based governance in order to produce a settlement that a variety of stakeholders can accept as reasonable. So what can we learn from this? I think first, it underscores that visions or visualizations, in the case of a map, of the losses that we face or could face, or the places that face a kind of higher threat of loss, those visions are plural and they're contested. So producing knowledge about loss is a lively terrain of social action. And in the context of climate change, loss participates in a more general problem of knowledge that undergirds social action vis-a-vis climate change, and that's the problem of attribution. Because climate change, both climate scientists and sociologists are aware, is actually a bundle of many alterations that are related to one another in complex and unevenly understood ways. So forging a connection between climate change and observed changes, so a few inches of sea level rise, a shift in average temperatures, or between climate change and single events, so a catastrophic flood or a hurricane of unprecedented strength. Forging those connections is a scientific and a discursive achievement. There's an abundance of data about various features of our ecological and biophysical conditions, an excess of objectivity, in the words of Daniel Sarowitz, which can be assembled in different reasonable ways. And depending on how you assemble all of that objective knowledge, you're going to get competing views of a particular problem and also competing views of how society might respond. So interpretations of the relationship between climate change and different observed shifts or discrete catastrophes, or in this case, assessed risks, inevitably vary, and they often conflict. And in this context, whether or how much of a loss can be identified as the result of climate change is itself at stake. It's a matter that may appear more or less settled depending on prevailing conditions, and one that is tied to the kinds of claims that implicated actors can then make. So I think the task of sociology is not to adjudicate how much of a loss is, quote unquote, really climate change, or whether a risk assessment accurately or objectively accounts for climate change, but rather to investigate how social actors identify evidence of loss and temporally and spatially delimit loss in pursuit of different objectives and claims. And that work, that social action, takes place in a variety of sites, including the media, policymaking arenas at multiple scales, in courts of law. And that work can either elevate or diminish the purported role of climate change. And in this case, it happened in a kind of public process of arriving at an understanding of loss that might govern a city. So the second thing to take away is that visions of loss don't just describe loss, they don't just project loss, they can produce them in the present in anticipation of a future. So this photo, I took this photo in Broad Channel, Queens. And what you're seeing here is a house that has been put up for sale. And there's a Stop FEMA Now poster in the window. And what I think this, and I think this photo evokes this precise point, that this is a house that is in a livable condition. It was repaired after Sandy. Flood insurance paid for the damage. It is otherwise kind of a back to normal, right? But this new understanding of the losses and the risks facing New York City leads this particular homeowner to sell their home, a home which may indeed have faced a loss in its property value because of this newly reassessed risk, before it is swept away by the next flood. And so this is something that other scholars are thinking about. My colleague at the LSE, Kasha Papraki, has written about a dynamic in Bangladesh, which is where her research is situated, a dynamic that she calls anticipatory ruination, right? The idea that parts of Bangladesh need to be depopulated Forms of kind of subsistence agriculture need to be removed and replaced with something else in anticipation of a future in which that change is going to be inevitable. So the work of actors in the present that is informed by particular visions of future loss in ways that can introduce losses in the present. We can also draw out some observations about what we might call the politics of loss. So thinking in terms of loss orients sociology and social science more generally perhaps to new sites for examining what we might think of as climate politics. So when we talk about climate politics, what we typically have in mind, what we typically focus on are the policies, the programs that are self-consciously and explicitly about climate change. So the Paris Agreement, the policy paradigms emerging from the UNFCCC, projects of urban climate governance, divestment campaigns, climate marches, climate justice movements, and so forth. But as the sociologist Daniel Aldana Cohen has argued, climate change stretches across many domains of political contestation, and it's bound up with fights over inequality in particular. But there are also fights about loss in this case, fights about the loss of economic rents and returns on investment, the loss of perquisites and privileges that accrue not only to elites and to powerful industries that benefit from commodified housing, but also to the property owning middle and working classes. So what I think this example suggests is that we can ask questions about the kinds of politics losses produce, so what constituencies and coalitions, what discourses and claims are created when land disappears or property values in risky areas collapse? Whose losses are made to matter and how? Or, how are existing social contracts tested and potentially reconfigured through changes to public policy in order to manage rising losses? So in this case, as climate impacts are economized by insurance, changing the costs and financial value, but also social and emotional values associated with property, we see new iterations of battles that are familiar to political sociology and political science in the US, but also in other national contexts. So fights about the role of the state in protecting investments, the limits of public versus private risk bearing, issues of solidarity and fairness in insurance, and the government's role in protecting people from the market. So mobilizations around loss might also lead us to think a little bit differently about quote unquote climate publics. So the idea of a climate public has an almost kind of naturalistic sensibility to it. This idea that climate change will forge constituencies or forge publics because climate change will imperil people in locally specific ways. People will connect that peril to climate change. They will realize or anticipate loss related to climate change, and they'll be kind of activated to engage politically to address it, to address climate change as the cause of the loss. But the example of Stop FEMA Now is a different kind of climate public, because nowhere in its advocacy and its activism did it self-consciously organize as a climate public. It didn't make claims about mitigating or adapting to climate change. Members, organizers of Stop FEMA Now that I interviewed and spent time with were very ambivalent about whether or not this had anything to do with climate change. Instead, it's a kind of accidental climate public in the sense that it's a constituency that's created by the public policies and economic arrangements that transmit changing hazards into daily life and its governance. So theirs is a politics of those who have in common what they stand to lose due to climate change. And their activism is ecologically decisive for whether or how radically carbon intensive arrangements of housing and property can change. So the constitution of new collectivities and constituencies around loss, like Stop FEMA Now, is one form of kind of path-dependent policy feedbacks that are relevant to how the politics of loss unfold. So the NFIP, like other examples of public policy we might think of, has significant political effects on social actors, on who they are, on what they want, on how and with whom they organize, to quote the political scientist Paul Pearson. So again, Stop FEMA Now organized members not principally as floodplain homeowners, but rather as flood zone homeowners. So their claims were not focused on their vulnerability to flooding, a vulnerability that is expected to intensify due to climate change. Instead, their claims were based on their designation as residents in official flood zones, areas that are identified and mapped for the purposes of public policy, areas that made them subject to certain kinds of requirements and regulations. So that constituency did not exist independently of the public policy for flood risk management. They kind of needed the map with its boundaries and its flood zones to recognize their shared exposure to loss. So this is, of course, not only a US dilemma. Every polity will experience some version of this, a problem of stable policy rules interacting with an unstable world, as Jacob Hacker and Paul Pearson have written, across policy domains, so housing, social welfare, employment, industrial policy, and so forth. Which is to say that, the category of climate policy, or what we might think of climate publics, is populated not only by things like emissions regulations or building codes and energy efficiency and transition policy, but also by the broader array of public policies that shape how people live and work. And those policies, with their particular constituencies, with their preferences, the channels of influence that they've created, those will be key sites at which the politics of loss unfold, and the social conditions of a climate change future are determined. So the questions we might take up are, will governments come to the aid of farmers in regions where changing precipitation patterns compromise agricultural production? Will residents be compensated for the costs of adjusting their settlements in vulnerable coastal areas? Will the state provide support to workers who lose jobs in industrial sectors that are declining as a result of climate policy? Which of these losses become areas of intervention and which do not? And I think these are the kinds of questions that we might take up across a number of different contexts and across a number of different scales. Okay. So I want to conclude by just briefly situating this project in a broader one, which is a kind of quasi-coordinated effort across disciplines to pursue an understanding of what I'm calling here the social life of climate change. Now, this isn't a school of thought or paradigm or anything like that. This is kind of my characterization of a growing body of scholarship that seems to share some combination of these three features. The first is an interest in what climate change does, rather than in just what climate change is. So I mean two things by this. The first is scholarship that recognizes that climate change is already having effects in the world that we ought to understand. And related to this, this means we can undertake research that addresses climate change without having to theorize climate change as such. Of course, doing that theorization is immensely important work, it's interesting work, but it's not the only interesting or worthy point of entry. Because again, climate change is, after all, it's not one type of thing, it's not one single effect, which implies, an empirically and analytically rigorous approach can address itself to spatially and historically specific impacts. Loss is one way to address those impacts, to examine what climate change kind of looks like when it hits the ground. Second, work on the social life of climate change is attentive to climate change as a set of physical and material effects, and as Mike Hulme has put it, a quote, resourceful idea and versatile explanation. So the things that are interesting are not just the social effects of climate change, but also the social effects of things that are done in the name of climate change. So when a policy is put in place to adapt a city to climate change, that has its own kinds of effects that may or may not address, the intended object. Might have kind of, scholars thinking about maladaptation or thinking about some of these questions. And finally, this is work that pushes against determinism and catastrophism. So, for instance, in the case of loss, climate change does not drive loss in a kind of deterministic or overly determined fashion. The work of individuals, groups, communities, powerful interests, institutions shapes the course of loss. It produces divergent outcomes in terms of who loses what, when, how much, and with what results at multiple geographic scales. And though much of the work in the social life of climate change is critical of sustainability thinking, particularly that which is premised on a kind of techno-solutionism, and it's also realistic about the immense disruption and destruction that we may be headed for, it does not consign human societies to catastrophe. It is open to transformative possibilities and new solidarities. Because we can lose, but we can also let go. We can let go of ways of living and working that are not making many people better off, of a status quo that is pathological for many people and for the planet. And I'll conclude finally, which is a bit of a plug. There is, when I say this is a kind of semi-coordinated, one of the ways in which it's semi-coordinated is we do have a group, an interdisciplinary group at the LSE called the Social Life of Climate Change. Megan Black, who I understand you've heard from earlier in your series, was part of it before she left us for MIT. We have a seminar series, and because of the world we live in now, it's been taking place on Zoom, and we expect it to be on Zoom at least next term. So if you're interested in joining any of our seminars, please DM me your email address in the chat, and I'll add you to our list, and we can continue the conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rebecca, for a fascinating talk and for the invitation. There are people in this room who work on similar issues, so it would be great to keep the ball rolling. Right, so we're now we'll do a Q&A session. As you can see, Sergei Astafov raised his hand, so that's the rules. You first raise a hand in the chat or if you're visible physically, and I'll let you speak. All right, so I got Sergei first and Andrei next.
Hello. Thank you very much for the amazing talk and just mesmerizing case study. I have several questions. Should I ask them together or? Okay, just together. Let's make three of them. Mm-hmm. The first one is probably to clarify. Were insurance companies engaged in creating the flood risk maps, and to what extent? I mean both governmental and non-governmental insurance companies, if there are governmental companies. The second one is smaller, but probably more interesting. What makes a map regulatory? How through which processes they gain that kind of legitimacy? At least in the case of New York floods. And the third one is, did you know from the start that loss would be a central category for your new type of sociology? And so were there any other categories that you, as well, at the beginning, which you later decided to put aside? Yeah.
Great, thanks so much. These are terrific questions. The first question about insurance companies, are they engaged in creating flood maps? Historically, they have not. Historically, the private market was not at all interested in underwriting flood risk. And so it wasn't interested in investing in the kind of knowledge practices or the technologies that you would need to assess flood risk in any kind of granular way. That has just recently changed. So this is like, this is the kind of coda to the book. This will be the next paper I write, is about private insurance companies have now developed what they believe to be sophisticated enough catastrophe modeling for both coastal and inland flooding to be able to assess risk, and because of other changes to flood insurance, price it competitively with the government. So they're like slowly starting to express interest in kind of biting off more of the flood risk market in the US. Of course, they're only interested in the risks that they can underwrite profitably, right? Which means that the worst risks will always be the kind of public responsibility. But this is a development that is kind of taking place right now. So it's something that I'm certainly kind of keeping an eye on, because I think this is, another kind of central theme is that in any, it's not just a US thing. I think we're seeing this in the UK. We're seeing it in France. We're seeing it in the Caribbean and in sub-Saharan Africa, where you have these kinds of new private sector techniques and technologies. And the question is always going to be, what is left to the state? What is left to kind of public liabilities to deal with? And who can kind of buy their way into private networks of risk sharing, who can kind of avail themselves of these new technologies and products. The second question, what makes a map regulatory, and how do they kind of attain that status? So because historically, this is, mapping flood risk for the purposes of pricing insurance has been kind of the complete purview of the federal government. They have all kinds of sort of protocols and rules about producing these flood maps. They do contract out a lot of the technical work to engineering companies, to hydrologists and other kinds of scientists, consulting companies. But the specifications are ones that are meant to serve the purposes of a public program. And so for a map to become regulatory, there's a kind of multi-year process of collecting, where it's available, collecting new topographical data about the way that real estate development has taken place, or green space has disappeared or been restored, whatever has changed. And so currently that's through a combination of what's called like LiDAR data, which is a kind of remote sensing data, but also field reconnaissance. So you have people actually going out into these areas and mapping them in kind of an old-fashioned way. And then there's a kind of long review process. The community itself gets a chance to review and potentially appeal these products. The appeals process is legally, technically open to all communities that get a flood map. But of course, a community like New York City, which has tons, lots and lots of revenue to put at the disposal of hiring its own engineers and its own scientists to do an appeal, that is not something that is shared by all communities with flood maps. So, communities that can't marshal the resources to appeal don't get a chance to. Once FEMA has come to kind of an agreement with any appeals, if they're launched, then the map becomes regulatory, becomes effective. And there's kind of a 6-month period in which the final map is disseminated, and then 6 months later, once everyone's meant to have kind of gotten up to speed, it becomes sort of the map that is meant to govern building codes, and that will be used to re-rate insurance when policies are renewed. And then the third question is such a good question. When did loss kind of enter the picture for me? The answer is quite late. This all started for me because, the big question for me has always been, how does climate change become an economic problem? Like, when we say that climate change is costly or will be costly, like, how do we know that? And if you want to kind of find a place to stand in the social world where you can witness people trying to answer that question themselves, insurance is a really useful site. That's where actors are really trying to get their arms around this problem. And it just so happened that as I was kind of putting together my prospectus for my PhD dissertation, Hurricane Sandy hit New York City. And I started hearing these stories about people rebuilding their houses, you know, like recovering from the storm, and then finding out that this sort of economic readjustment had taken place. And now it did not look like they were going to be able to sustain their homes. And so I thought, well, that's a really interesting problem. Like, I'm just going to go to New York and try to figure out what that's all about. And the project kind of grew in this, like, eventually I figured out, you know, I got to go back into the National Archives and figure out what this program was about at the start. And it kind of grew from there. And it really wasn't until I collected all of this data, this, you know, documentary, textual, ethnographic interview data, that I was like, you know, what is this fundamentally about? What are the kind of core dilemmas here? That loss really kind of became the motif, you know, for the book. And that happened sort of because I was working on the manuscript as I was working on this article. And so they kind of co-evolved in a sense, where, you know, it was like, once I started thinking about loss in my own case, I was like seeing how it could be productive across a number of different concerns. And a lot of that, you know, came out of just really fruitful conversations with friends and colleagues of mine who are urbanists, who are rural sociologists, who are sociologists of consumption, you know, being in spaces like this precisely, to have some of these conversations, that's how that kind of became a unifying theme for me.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, I got Andrei next.
Hello, Rebecca, thank you very much for your fascinating presentation. You get lots of interesting stories, and I'm pretty sure that your book is worth reading, and I'm going to do this. But maybe disappointing. My question will be more conceptual, not about the stories. So, do you think about the opportunity to recode your conception of sociology of loss in the terms of having? So in order to lose something, you need to have something first. But what we have, or what somebody has, is not self-evident. Mm-hmm. And it also, to have something, or to appropriate something, or to acquire something, whether it's a house with an insurance or with risks, or you can, in contemporary world, you already can acquire risks. You can buy some risks, or you can buy some assets, yes, with risky assets. And this process is kind of tricky, and it implies learning. So many things are not so easy to acquire, mm-hmm. especially if they are not in commodity form. So mm-hmm. I'm studying innovations, and one of the processes, so you cannot just buy the new product. It is not existent at some point. So, but you're already trying to figure it out what it will be. So, what if we recode your conception in the terms of having, and so it won't be not so negative, because loss is about negative side of having, and we can also focus or refocus our attention on describing of the processes of having, mm-hmm. or learning to have. So just do you consider this possibility? So the one point is that we will focus on the previous story about having something, on the differences of what we are having, mm-hmm. and who have what and when and where. And the other point is that it won't be so negative. So it would be about the positivity of losing. I mean, and we can. You have this loss. So this the idea. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's a really fascinating provocation, and one that I'll have to think a little bit more about. But my initial thoughts, I suppose, are, yeah, I mean, in some ways, like, I'm more comfortable in the melancholy of loss than I am in the positive. I guess, I mean, temperamentally, you know, this is perhaps in some ways, to be very kind of biographical about, you know, the way we develop concepts. It's like, to deal with my own like tragic feelings about the climate crisis, like, I had to give it some derive some analytical purchase, some leverage out of it, you know? So like, really kind of staying with the discomfort and the melancholy of it. In some ways, it's just been, I think, a weird balm for me. I mean, I don't know. I think because sustainability, I think, is this very kind of positive, affirming, harmonious, sort of spirited, you know, paradigm alternative. I don't know. I just, like, this for me had to be something different. It had to have a different kind of emotional valence. I just had to, in the paper, I describe it as a kind of anti-Whiggish engagement with climate change. It just abandons the premise that things will or are okay. Like, I just, like, that's kind of just where I am with it, I suppose. But beyond the kind of sentiment, I am thinking now about what it is to have. And I mean, maybe more precisely, what it is to hold on. So part of what, you know, when I met people like Palmer, when you do ethnographic work, you know, you get entangled, you know, you get invested in people's lives and in their stories. And I found myself feeling very sympathetic to his desire to stay put, even though I personally believe these are parts of the city that are going to become more dangerous, you know? And so it got me thinking about, like, well, where does this sense that what we have now, the land as it looks right now, the people who live there right now, what is it that creates this sense that it should always be that way? So I'm thinking right now about this idea of incumbency, this idea of holding on to what is there and who is there, and all of the effort that goes into preventing the changes to those things. And I'm thinking about it, here, I think, whereas insurance was a useful site for thinking about loss, I think for thinking about incumbency, things like infrastructure are really interesting. Like what are all the kinds of sentiments and beliefs about holding on that are embodied in a flood wall, you know? Because the protection of a flood wall also stops at some point, you know? So allowing a certain place to hold on, or allowing certain people to hold on for at least a little while longer, consigns other people to greater hazard, you know? Like, it prevents the movement of water in ways that could make it actually much more dangerous for other people beyond the flood wall. You know, so I am kind of thinking about this, like, who gets to have and who gets to hold on to what they have. And I think that is related. It's kind of the necessary kind of other side of the coin from this question of loss and who loses, and who loses more. So yeah, but again, I mean, really interesting provocation, and one that I'll have to think more about.
Maybe just 2 more words. So I think that we have we could have retained this feeling, an emotional feeling of melancholy, if we focus on such expressions as someone say, "I have a diabetes."
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, I see.
So
what you're saying.
it's not happy, actually,
Yeah.
and you're not I think that you may not risk falling into alarmism. So it's like the discourse of loss. It's a catastrophic discourse. So there will be no anything. So there won't be anything. But the problem, and in your story, the problem is that this man, he is trying to learn how to have these kind of house, this kind of property, and that's the problem. It's not the problem of emancipation, of flying away to some other place and planet or whatever and lose this for some point. So I'm not just, it's a kind of thank you very much.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. Thank you for that.
Okay, Nikolai was next.
Yeah, Rebecca, thank you very much. My name is Nicole Erdink. I am a STS scholar here in Science, Technology, Studies Center, as well as Andrei and Dmitry, and so on. I would like to make a difference that maybe STS scholars usually do not make between scientists and policymakers. And my question, maybe I have missed this in your story, maybe you have spoken about that, but I didn't hear. So how the scientists of floods, I mean, first of all, hydrologists or climate change scientists, saw the temporal dimension of the flood. So were a controversy between them about that, or two models that, or two maps that you mentioned were created just because of the policy pressure? So it is a question.
Yeah, great. Thanks for the question. So the multiple maps, I mean, the first thing to say is perhaps like this is in some ways a question of how you interpret the events as they unfolded. And my interpretation of the events as they unfolded on the timeline that they unfolded at the municipal and the national level is that, and this is based also on kind of observing the webinars of the TMAC and reading the meeting minutes and reading the reports and everything, is that pretty quickly there emerged a pretty solid kind of technical consensus about the appropriate ways to solve the problem that the TMAC had been given, which was how do we make how do we make flood risk products incorporate what this legislation called the best available climate science. And the report, the TMAC report, deals with like how do we think about epistemic uncertainty? How do we think about aleatory uncertainty? All of these kinds of questions lead them to recommend an approach that involves projections of different scenarios that are characterized by different levels of uncertainty. So the question, so the TMAC kind of, they feel like they've addressed that question, and they only produce kind of 2 reports and kind of consider their work done. What they leave, they actually discuss this, and they're kind of the TMAC meetings at a certain stage become open to the public, and people show up and they ask, like, well, what does this actually mean for the rating of insurance? That's what these maps are for, but incidentally, like that's what this is all about. So how is this going to affect the price of insurance? And the TMAC says, well, that's not our job actually to figure it out. We are answering the very specific question you asked, which is how do we incorporate climate science into the maps? That's it. So I think the proliferation of the maps, in my interpretation, reflects the fact that, the program is under some obligation to demonstrate that it can incorporate climate science into maps, but it is not necessarily under an obligation to make those projections of different kind of climate futures relevant to how insurance is priced. That's a decision they get to make. And so I think the controversy in New York City, which then becomes a nationwide controversy that I talk about more in the book, I think leads to the kind of doubling of the map. the production of two different maps. Now, this is in some ways still a kind of open question about what this is ultimately going to look like, because when New York City and FEMA jointly announced this compromise, they say this is going to be a demonstration project for how we're going to handle this around the country. You know, New York City is the first, but this is just what it's going to look like. But it's not actually clear that this is happening. You know, it's all NFIP communities are kind of on different timelines with getting new maps, and it's all distributed across a number of regional offices and things like that. So, so how this actually kind of works in practice, I think there's sort of more empirical story to tell. But that's my interpretation based on the kind of data that I collected about how this process unfolded.
Yeah, Rebecca, I'm sorry. My question was also about, are the models that you mentioned, like the different models that include different uncertainties. So are they somehow based on the models by climate scientists? So did you speak with climate scientists who made these models? Yeah, right. My question is how they saw these models. So were some of them more relevant than others, and so on?
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, yes, these are kind of the methodology that's developed or recommended by the TMAC is directly related to the methodologies that are used by climate scientists to arrive at projections and visualizations of sea level rise. So weirdly enough, New York City also has its own kind of, it's called the NYPCC, I think, or the NYCC. It has its own kind of shop for creating models and maps of how climate change will affect New York City. That it's been using for planning and using for kind of communicating to the public about climate change. And so the TMAC actually cites those models as a good example. So it's very much kind of coherent with the way that climate scientists are modeling this particular hazard, certainly, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Right, Irina Antashuk, if she's with us. Okay.
Okay. So I'm here for a little while. Thanks very much for the interesting presentation. My question is about, you know, I like very much the expression of loss. For me, it's like another angle of the value concept. And I want to ask, so it seems to me that there are contradictions which are the same as for the value concept, this economic and non-economic terms, you know, this financial and non-financial, economic understanding and more wide understanding. Mm-hmm. How do you address it? I'm sorry, I'm now driving a car, so I'm basically speaking while being on the road. But you know, loss has this connotation of being, on the one hand, we have gains and losses in economic terms. On the other hand, you speak about a whole variety of emotional, you know, experiences of surviving the loss. And the interesting point for me here is that these financial and monetary things, they do not cover the whole range of loss as an experience, as a practice. Probably you have already, you know, somehow found a way to sort of complement these visions, or somehow to, you know, soften these contradictions, if you can say so. Mm-hmm. So thanks very much.
Yeah, thanks so much. I'm very impressed by the commitment to continue to participate while in the car. You're absolutely right. I mean, this question, at least in this context, I think the question of value cannot be divorced from the question of loss. In the paper where I try to take kind of a broader sweep of disciplinary concerns and intellectual concerns, I think, you know, the connection to value isn't necessarily as strong, but in this case, absolutely. And in actually the second chapter of the book, the second chapter of the book is called Values at Risk. Or that's the subtitle of the book, of the chapter. And what that chapter looks at, and that's actually the most ethnographically informed, probably of all the parts of the book, because it looks at this question of, well, what value do people think is imperiled and by what? So this idea of kind of value at risk is mobilized in a, in governance context, there's $129 billion of value at risk, right, in the floodplain. And that's meant to kind of, at least in theory, kind of empower us to make a kind of informed, rational decision about how to understand a city. But my question was, well, for for a typical New Yorker, what values do they feel are threatened, and what do they feel is threatening them? And it's not just, they don't feel threatened just by flood risk. They feel threatened by the flood insurance program itself. They feel threatened by kind of larger economic forces that create pressures up on top of which flood insurance, is making things worse. And then the values that they feel are imperiled are not just their property values. Of course, they're worried about their property values, but they're also worried about the kind of social and emotional value of a place that in some cases they've lived their whole lives, or they've, their generations of their families have lived. They're also worried about values in the sense of beliefs, like moral commitments about what is right, so values of equity and values of fairness are relevant to how people understand what they're up against. I had this woman who's a construction manager in Queens, and she made the point. She was like, these changing prices, they're threatening me. I might not be able to afford my house, but the price of insurance can go up forever in the Hamptons, where movie stars and bankers and, where they live, like they can go up forever and it will never push them away from the coast. So I can't live here. It's not fit for me to live here on the, near the water, but those people, it's perfectly fine. They can pay any price. And so this question of like how to think about what is fair, what is equitable, like those kinds of the values that people attach to those ideas, I think also really explain how they respond, how they understand themselves as situated vis-a-vis these kind of larger political, economic, and ecological forces. So yeah, I mean, I guess I don't view the connection between value and loss as a contradiction. I think they're kind of, actually empirically very entangled, but also kind of analytically related in ways that, yeah, another part of the book explores in more detail.
Right. Thanks. I have. So we should gradually move to the conclusion. But I have another a question in the chat from Natalia Trigubova, who is our colleague at the State University, and that I think is fitting. That it's a kind of broad question. How would you summarize your theoretical conclusions about what the problem of climate change brings to sociology? What is new here in comparison to more mainstream topics as social inequality, development of the public sphere, social production of knowledge, etc.? So I think it's a good place to offer a broad reflection.
Yeah, a big question. I mean, so this is an idea I'm kind of continuing to develop. But I think some of our kind of fundamental, and this is also like, I just published an essay with a colleague, Ryan Hagan, about disasters, which is in some ways is a kind of related idea to the extent that we think of our climate change present and the climate change future as defined by disasters of various kinds. But I think climate change has to lead us into thinking differently about continuity and disruption, about what is pathological and what is normal. I mean, these are kind of fundamental concerns about the kind of temporal ordering, the temporal nature of social order that I think climate change in some ways destabilizes. You know, if like, I mean, an example to try to put this more concretely is like the California wildfire season is increasingly like just, it never ends. And the same with the hurricane season in the Gulf. Like this isn't a period of disruption that's kind of, you know, temporally delimited. It's just, that is what we live in right now. And so what is normal then? And when we say getting back to normal, what normal are we even talking about anymore? I mean, I think these are kind of fundamental questions about the ordering of societies and the way that they govern themselves to anticipate futures that I think are potentially really, really destabilizing and transformative for the social sciences. You know, and so, I mean, and the other way to kind of think about, and that's still, I mean, again, I'm still kind of working through these ideas, but I think more concretely, and to kind of celebrate work that I think is really productive in this vein, to use your question about inequality. I think for a long time, social scientists who are interested in climate change were saying, well, inequality exists and climate change has come along and it's making inequality worse and it's revealing the inequalities that already exist. But I think what we've actually, what's been really powerful for me is the work that's actually coming from you know, historians and critical feminist scholars and indigenous scholars who are saying that the relationship between inequality and climate change is not that straightforward, actually. Or it is that straightforward, but it's also much more profound. Like inequality is a defining cause of climate change. Like you can't understand climate change without understanding settler colonialism and white supremacy and patriarchy. Like these are all things that are absolutely imbricated in the very generation of the crisis that we now face. So it's not like other things created inequality and then climate change kind of hits them in the 21st century. Like these are things we have to understand as kind of historically imbricated, you know, they have to be central to our analysis, which incidentally also means that any research we might want to do in the interest of advancing climate justice has to take seriously that kind of profound relationship between inequality and climate change. And so, and honestly, like my, you know, and this is again reflecting my kind of positionality in an largely Anglo-American discourse. I feel like that sensibility has been much more absorbed by activists than it has by scholars. You know, I think activists are making that claim really forcefully in a way that kind of scholarship could still catch up with and give us more to work with. I mean, there are people who've written so powerfully about this, people like Nick Estes, this you know, indigenous historian. You know, I think there's just more space to kind of take those provocations really seriously and to think about how our kind of central concerns and our central kind of topics, our bread and butter in sociology and the social sciences might need to be rethought once climate change enters the frame.
Okay, thanks, Rebecca. Thanks very much. Unless there are further questions in the chat, let me check. Yeah, I think, so let's just give Rebecca a round of applause using this. And yeah, thanks very much for being with us for a very interesting conversation. And I'm really hoping we could continue. Yeah, okay, thanks. I'm stopping the recording now.
Thanks so much. This was really, really a treat. Thank you so much for